I'm Edward Warfield. I'm the publisher of Citybiz. I'm honored today to interview Dr. Brad Schlaggar, the CEO of Kennedy Krieger Institute. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks, Edwin. It's good to be here.
Can you give us a little bit of background on the mission and the vision for the Kennedy Krieger Institute?
I'd be delighted to. So the Kennedy Krieger Institute, I think, has a breathtaking mission. We transform the lives of children, adolescents, and adults with and those at risk of developing disorders of the developing nervous system. That's the brain, spinal cord, nerve, and muscle. And we do that through innovative treatment and research and special education and advocacy, community partnerships, and training. We train the next generation of providers as well. So this constellation of activities, there's no place like it anywhere that has all of those under one roof, if you will.
So when did you decide that you wanted to become a pediatric neurologist?
Well, I think it really started as a college student. I was an undergraduate at Brown University doing research in neuroscience. And that's when I realized, I'd always wanted to be a physician, but that's when I realized that there was a really compelling case to be made for studying how the nervous system develops. And importantly, I met a child neurologist. I didn't even know they existed until that time. But my mentor's wife happened to be a resident in child neurology in Boston at the Massachusetts General Hospital. So I started to understand that there was a career path, but it really happened when I was a graduate student at Washington University, and I met really the vanguard at the time, the vanguard of child neurology internationally happened to be at that institution. And it was just, it was a combination of what they studied and what they cared about, but also the sort of esprit de corps of the profession. People who get pulled into child neurology, there's a real calling, and I felt really at home amongst them. So I think it happened mostly as a graduate student, and then it got consolidated during my clinical training, and I'm just really grateful for that decision.
And so you spent 19 years at Washington University School of Medicine. Can you tell us about that tenure and tell us about the decision to come on board with Kennedy Krieger?
19 years on the faculty, but really 32 years overall. I went there for medical school and graduate school, and I stayed for residency and fellowship, all the things that follow. And then, so after 13 years, joined the faculty. And I really thought that I was going to be a lifer at Washington University, happily so. My wife, also a scientist at Washington University, we viewed it as an ideal location for us. And I had been turning down lots of opportunities to do something like, rise up through the ranks in academia all along. I'll just say that I was a typical academic. I was doing research, seeing patients, training medical students and residents, as well as graduate students and postdocs. And it's sort of a nirvana for the academic type. And I loved it. But then this incredible opportunity arose. I wasn't expecting it, wasn't planning on it, but Kennedy Krieger sort of tapped me on the shoulder. And I remember the moment of realization. I was actually on a trip to England, and I got this message from Kennedy Krieger saying, "Are you interested in this position?" succeeding the prior CEO who had been at it for 30 years. And I remember thinking, this sounds like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But I was in London, and my wife was in St. Louis. I had to kind of wait for her to wake up so I could share this with her. And she had the same response. The description sounded like something that I really needed to do because the mission of this institute aligns with my own personal mission so completely. It was impossible to not. It felt like the right decision. And so I hadn't really been thinking about this kind of a position, but then my whole experience leading up to this opportunity, including leadership positions within Washington University and at St. Louis Children's Hospital, I started to understand why taking on this kind of a role matters. But even still, if it wasn't Kennedy Krieger Institute, I wasn't going to jump at it. This place is special. And so the combination of all that changed my mind and made me realize that a move was imminent. And the other thing I'd say is that, and this is something that I've shared, it's out there. We had our own challenges as parents. Our oldest child is now 15 and doing well, but when he was 10, he was diagnosed with a life-threatening illness. And we experienced many of the challenges that the families we serve experience. And one of the takeaway messages for both me and my wife was that you only get one crack at this. So when a really special opportunity comes along, take it. And so that was our guiding thought process. And it's almost 3 years now. And even with all the challenges of the last year and a half, it's been just an extremely gratifying decision. Very happy to be in Baltimore at Kennedy Krieger Institute.
Can you provide a snapshot of where Kennedy Krieger is today in terms of, give us some idea of the range of services, how many patients you see per year, how many students, how many locations, just a snapshot of Kennedy Krieger.
Absolutely. I think that we are most known for our patient care, but even then, it's probably not fully recognize the depth and breadth of what we provide. So at this time, we have about 2,700 employees. About 600 of those are clinicians. And we see about 25,000 unique patients each year. And that's across 85 or so unique clinical programs. It includes our inpatient hospital, which is downtown East Baltimore location. It's sort of intercalated into the Johns Hopkins Medical Campus in East Baltimore. So we have an inpatient hospital, but we also have this very large outpatient ambulatory practice. This year, we're going to get close to 300,000 patient visits, which is an extraordinary number for the number of clinicians and patients that we see. But in addition, we have a research institute doing cutting edge from bench research, laboratory investigation, all the way out to public health, population health, and it's really everything in between. We're known internationally for our ability to characterize fully the so-called phenotyping of patients. That's one of our most well-known skill sets. So our research program is substantial. We have schools. One of the things that I think is not well known in Baltimore and in the region is that we have 4 Kennedy Krieger schools. They serve kids from age 5 to 21, K through 12 kind of programming. And 3 of those campuses are in Baltimore, and 1 is presently in Montgomery County. We're about to move to a new site nearby in Prince George's County. And those are children whose special education needs are not completely served in the local school system. So we're available, as are other such non-public schools in Maryland, to take on those students that often have really complex challenges in terms of medical complexity, learning, as well as some behavioral challenges. We also have the Maryland Center for Developmental Disabilities, or I should say that for the students, we have about 500 students across all those schools. We have the Maryland Center for Developmental Disabilities embedded. That's an advocacy engine. We train nearly 1,000 trainees each year come through our doors. Many of them are short-term, but about 30% of them are multiple year fellowship trainees. And this is a powerful mechanism. Those graduates disseminate our expertise out wherever they go to practice. And we have community programs, one of the most important of which I think is in the early childhood space. And another area is in our Center for Child and Family Traumatic Stress, which for 30 plus years has been providing trauma-informed care for children who are exposed to adverse experiences, particularly important this past year and months. So this is initially we were right in East Baltimore, but we now have 20 locations throughout Maryland, primarily in the central Maryland lanes, but our reach is through every part of the state, every jurisdiction. And about 85% of our patients come from Maryland. The remainder come from all over the U.S. and dozens of countries from outside the U.S. So a really significant footprint with a significant international reputation as well.
So you became CEO in 2018. Can you share some of your milestones between 2018 and today?
I view those nearly 3 years in two chunks. There's obviously the pre-pandemic version and then the peri-pandemic where we're in right now. So and one of the things I should also say is that this is an institute that was in excellent hands and very well run. It didn't have major issues that needed to be solved. So it allowed the new CEO to come in and think, okay, what's next? What we've been able to do is focus on things like increasing more clinicians through recruitment, our number of clinicians and scientists. So we're refreshing our research laboratories by bringing in more mission-driven kinds of investigators. That's very exciting. We've significantly increased our presence in Annapolis. We brought in a director of government relations, and we have been cultivating and building relationships with elected and governmental officials, availing ourselves and our expertise as partners. And the yield of that is both really gratifying support from the state for our mission, but also being asked by elected officials and government officials to partner to a greater extent, which we see ourselves as that's a key to our mission as well, is to be available as a resource, a real expert resource for the state of Maryland. Nationally too, but we've been very intentional about making those connections at the state level. One of the important things that we've done is reorganized and reimagined our clinical trials unit. So I should say a bit more about that. We take care of kids and adolescents and adults with rare and common disorders of the developing nervous system. Well, those rare conditions, there really needs to be a venue for individuals to be able to partake in clinical trials. And it takes a special kind of knowledge and focus to make that happen. So we have recruited in a new director of our clinical trials unit, and our focus is on building an infrastructure to make it possible for any patient that we see, if there's a clinical trial out there for that patient, to make it available. I see that as a fundamental part of equity-based care and treatment to make that possible. We created an office for health, equity, inclusion, and diversity, and created the position of a chief diversity officer. Our view of that role for Kennedy Krieger Institute is that we are advocates and champions for inclusion, especially for individuals with disabilities, but not limited to those individuals, to view that comprehensively in all aspects of our society. So this Office of Health, Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity is both internally focused, but also externally in all of the different domains of our activities. And I'll just add that we've also been very focused on increasing the diversity of our leadership team, which is a very important part of our future as well. So lots of milestones. Some of them were interrupted to some extent by the pandemic, but in many respects they were actually enhanced and facilitated by the clear need to move in those directions. So I think we're all gratified. We have a shared leadership concept at the Institute, and I think we're all gratified for the progress that we're making in those directions.
So Kennedy Krieger was implementing telehealth prior to the pandemic. So can you tell us about how Kennedy Krieger has embraced telehealth prior to the pandemic and sort of post-pandemic?
So we had a couple of programs that had been pretty mature by the time the pandemic hit in telehealth. So one was a behavioral health program that we've implemented through our behavioral psychology department and their collaboration with Fort Meade and the community around Fort Meade. The idea is that active duty military, in terms of readiness for deployment, if there are issues in the household, including behavioral health challenges for their children, then they're not going to be ready to deploy. So this was a partnership, a collaboration with the Department of Defense that goes back 5 or so years prior to the pandemic. In addition, we had a more medically focused telehealth program with Atlantic General Hospital down in Berlin. And that was a mechanism for our experts in child development to do remote assessments for children being seen at that hospital. And so the combination of those two programs, that one had been around for a couple of years as well, put us in a position that March of 2020, when it became obvious, even before the governor's mandate to shut things down, families were already saying, I don't feel comfortable coming on site. We knew that there had to be I'm sorry for the overused word, but a pivot to telehealth. And our existing programs, we had maybe 15 clinicians who were involved in that activity. They made it possible for us. They sort of tutored the rest of the clinical staff, and told us how to set up the systems. So in 2 weeks' time, we went from 15 providers and a couple dozen visits a week to on the order of 600 providers and on the order of 4,500 to 5,000 telehealth visits per week. It was a remarkable experience, and we know we knew at the time that it'd be important to study the effectiveness of that kind of delivery of care. So we have a really good idea of how we would want to continue to implement telehealth not as a sole mechanism, but as part of the armamentarium for optimal treatment of children with all of the different types of conditions that we see.
Can you share some of the strategic goals for Kennedy Krieger Institute going forward?
Certainly. So I mentioned that research was a very important direction for us. We have a strong presence in the research world. Our research institute is well known and respected, especially, as I mentioned, in phenotyping and in neuroimaging. But we want to expand our research footprint. There are opportunities that are in front of us that have been untapped. So, for example, we have these really full-service schools that, in addition to the educational content, they have all their related services, clinical-related services available to students there as well. But we've never used the information from those settings to understand how to take data acquired and optimize outcomes for each individual student. So understanding how our research and our educational mission intersect, that's a major strategic direction for us. I mentioned that we want to enhance our clinical trials unit. We're in the midst of that. We want to recruit in more investigators and clinicians who want to really run with the clinical trial piece. Again, it's important as no longer can we say we're focused on diagnosis and prognosis. We really need to be at the leading edge of interventions to change outcomes, to optimize outcomes. I'm very interested in our community partnerships. I see us as an anchor institution in the neighborhood where we sit in East Baltimore, and a significant amount of our energy is focused on building our strategic partnerships with the community so that we add, even to a greater extent, add to the opportunities in the communities where we sit. So there's a whole slew of strategic initiatives. the new CEO, the job is to come up with a strategic plan. We had that framework in place, and we're starting to share it with our institute stakeholders, our 2,700 staff, back in February and March of 2020, and then we put it on pause. We are now back into the full-on strategic planning mode, which I just shared on a call this morning. I view as a fundamentally optimistic activity. It's thinking about the future. It's great therapy for pulling yourself out of the pandemic mindset of managing day to day and moving into that optimistic. What are our big plans for the future way of thinking?
So, how have Kennedy Krieger's education programs evolved over the years?
Well, the origins of the education programs, it was really focused on challenges with learning disabilities like reading impairment or so-called dyscalculia, math impairment. And in the early days, every activity at the Institute was all at our first building at 707 North Broadway. Everything was in that building. But over time, the school mission has evolved to now really be a mechanism for those students who there really aren't optimal situations for them in their local school systems. So the local school systems refer, and these are from jurisdictions from across the state. So this year, I think 14 of the jurisdictions are sending students to Kennedy Krieger schools. We're now a mechanism to take on the most challenging situations to make sure that every student has access to a fair and free and appropriate public education opportunity.
And what is the vision for the Center of Innovation and Leadership in Special Education?
So that's a really thoughtful program that predates me. It was the brainchild of Dr. Nancy Grasmick, who's our board chair. And people in Maryland know her. She's a legend in education as the longstanding Secretary of Education for Maryland Department of Education. And she recognized and put in motion this program that is focused on expanding the expertise of general education educators throughout the state. So it's one thing to have special education focused educators embedded in schools like ours, but to disseminate that expertise, you need to get that same kind of expertise into the general education setting. So initially it was for training leaders in that direction who would come in and do a fellowship and then go back into their school systems and with that knowledge in hand influence the direction. The movement that we're heading towards now is really capacity building to make it possible for general education teachers overall to have access to that kind of expertise, to disseminate it in a way that embeds special education savvy into the general education classroom. It's an idea that really fits in with our overall training model. We can't see every patient, we can't educate every student. So by training up the clinician and the teacher, it's a mechanism of it's an amplifier or a multiplier effect, and so I think it's a really important direction for the Institute.
So let's bring the interview back to where your area of expertise, and that is. I was wondering, are there any new or pending technological breakthroughs in pediatric neurology that will have a significant impact? Is there anything that you see on the horizon that will dramatically change?
I think we're right at this leading edge where we're seeing the opportunities for not just gene therapy, but also what's called small molecule therapy to target in really specific ways disorders of the developing nervous system. A good example is what's happened with spinal muscular atrophy, a disease that's in some respects like the ALS, but for the developing for the child. where the nerve cells that control movement in the spinal cord degenerate for reasons that are actually fairly well known at this point. And there's now, amazingly, there's now two very targeted therapies that one uses gene therapy, the other so-called small molecules, that changes the clinical course for those patients. It's another breathtaking area in our world of child neurology. And I think more and more disorders that are well defined like that are going to succumb to those kinds of interventions. And that's one of the reasons why we're building up our clinical trials unit, just that argument. But I think there's going to be more savvy with brain-machine interface technology and non-invasive ways to interact with the nervous system in children, safe and non-invasive, to take on disorders that are not going to be so amenable to a molecule or a gene. We're going to, because of inroads from other areas, like computational approaches and biomedical engineering approaches, we're going to learn more about how to use information that comes off the genome or comes off of an MRI machine to integrate that information to make single patient level predictions for optimal treatment and to understand outcomes. So I think this is a really exciting time for pediatric neurology because the fruits of decades of research on the nervous system, but also other technologies, will converge to give us the tools necessary to really change outcomes.
Your research is focused on pediatric movement disorders, including Tourette syndrome and development disorders of language and cognition. Can you provide a snapshot of your research?
Pediatric neurologist who has focused on disorders that affect cognition, language, and movement. In many respects, I'm at the interface between neurology and psychiatry and other mental health disciplines because conditions like Tourette syndrome, for example, which is known for tics, motor and vocal ticking, those individuals very often, the tics are not the major problem for that individual. They often have ADHD and OCD or disorders of affect like depression. They have learning challenges like reading impairment and so on. So Tourette was a way for me to really get my arms around development of neuropsychiatric conditions and then study it. In the late 1990s, when I came out of my residency, there wasn't much of what I would refer to as a developmental cognitive neuroscience. That's people studying the development of cognition using brain imaging in children. So my contribution is really in helping to establish a field of development of cognition using tools like behavior and neuroimaging to understand both typical and atypical development. And it's been really gratifying. So now 20 years later, to see just how significant that world has become. My research is now really first on characterizing typical and atypical development of cognition, but also how to use that information to understand individuals. It's interesting to know what a group, Tourette's versus people without Tourette's, what that looks like, but it doesn't necessarily help you understand the patient that's in front of you. And that's the North Star. How do I help this person? Why am I doing this research? It's not just to discover interesting things. Ultimately, it's to help people. And so the direction that I and my colleagues have taken is to move ourselves towards understanding individual patients so we can know what's best for that person, not what's best on average for the group that they happen to be a part of.
Can you share some of the ways that the work of Kennedy Krieger's clinicians, researchers, and educators translates into locally based efforts such as the vaccine clinics, or even the work that supports families addressing trauma?
Well, the timeliness of the vaccine clinic question is great because yesterday we had which was June 13th, we had our third drive-through vaccination clinic where at our parking garage adjacent to our buildings on the East Baltimore campus, we had our staff, 100 plus volunteering each of the 3 drive-through clinic days, so that families with their kids as young as age 12 who have developmental challenges or anxiety or other reasons why they could not reasonably get their vaccination done in a different kind of venue came and were able to get hundreds of our patients, their families, their direct service providers vaccinated. And what that is it's a combination of the clinicians and the educators, but also our just our overall mission to serve in that way. The vaccination clinics, I think, is a great example. One of the other areas that I think exemplifies this coming together is our post-secondary programs. So we have through our schools, we have 2 mechanisms for graduates of our K through 12 program to get work-based experience to help them with subsequent employment. One is called Project Search, which was it's an internship or set of internships. And the other is called Core Foundations, which is learning basic skill sets. This gets at why do we do what we do overall? The ultimate goal is for our graduates, our patients, our students to live their most complete and satisfying and accomplished life. We want them to, for example, to have opportunities to be employed. So these efforts, which are bringing together expertise from our clinicians and educators and others, it's a really mission-driven part of our activity. And it doesn't happen unless you have all of that different savvy coming together. It's part of what we call our Neurodiversity at Work initiative.
So is there any part of the Kennedy Krieger Institute story that you haven't shared with us, or something else that you'd like to tell our audience?
Well, I think one thing to know is that we've been around for almost 85 years now, since 1937, starting out as what was then called the Children's Rehabilitation Institute. And even then it was at the cutting edge. A orthopedic surgeon named Winthrop Phelps, who understood the importance of a full rehab approach for children with cerebral palsy. But we're long-standing. We've grown an order of magnitude in the last 25 years. And we have this long-standing affiliation and partnership with Johns Hopkins. We're often thought to be a part of Johns Hopkins. And it's understandable why there's that perception. Our faculty, like myself, I'm a professor of neurology and pediatrics at Johns Hopkins, but we're a separate entity with an affiliation. And so I think one of the things to know is that we have a strong and ever strengthening relationship with Johns Hopkins that makes it possible for us to recruit in some of the best academics from around the country. And we're very thankful for that collaboration and partnership with Hopkins.
So Brad, thank you for sharing your time and your vision for the Kennedy Krieger Institute. It's important work, and we appreciate your contributions.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.